There's a loneliness that no amount of company can cure, a solitude that doesn't lessen when you're surrounded by people. In fact, the more people around you, the more intense it becomes. If you know this feeling, if you know exactly what I'm talking about, then you've probably started to awaken, and Eckhart Tolle has something profoundly revealing to tell you about it. You're not alone in this loneliness. But here's the paradox. Just by awakening, you're going to feel more alone than ever. And that's not a problem to be solved. It's a portal to be crossed. In the next few moments, you'll understand why the spiritual path is intrinsically lonely, why trying to escape this solitude is exactly what keeps you trapped, and most importantly, how to transform this emptiness into your greatest teacher. But first, I need to show you something that Tolle revealed that completely changes how we understand loneliness. Eckhart Tolle went through a radical transformation at 29. He was living in such an intense state of anxiety and depression that one night he thought he couldn't bear himself any longer. And it was in that moment of total dissolution that something extraordinary happened. The self he thought he was simply disappeared. What was left was pure presence. Consciousness without object. But here's a detail that few people know. In the years following that transformation, Tolle lived in almost complete solitude. He spent 2 years sitting on park benches in London, observing, being present, but completely alone. People passed him by every day, and none of them had the slightest idea that this seemingly aimless man had experienced something that most human beings don't even know exists. Why would someone who discovered profound peace choose to be alone? Why not immediately go out and share this discovery? The answer lies in Tolle's own teaching. In The Power of Now, he writes something that few truly comprehend. If you can't be at peace with yourself when you're alone, you'll seek out a relationship to cover up your discomfort. And that discomfort will reappear in another form. Read that again. If you can't be at peace with yourself when you're alone, you will seek out a relationship to cover up your discomfort. Most people flee from loneliness as they flee from death. And that's no coincidence. Loneliness puts you face to face with something the ego considers its greatest threat: emptiness. And in the emptiness, the ego has nowhere to stand. There are no thoughts to distract, no dramas to feed on, no stories to tell. There's just you, naked before yourself. And here's the first paradox I need you to understand. The loneliness you feel isn't the problem. Loneliness is the symptom that you're starting to see through the illusion. That's kept you trapped your whole life. Let me explain this more clearly. The ego, this mental construct that you've mistaken for who you are, needs constant external validation to exist. It needs confirmation, approval, reactions. It needs other people to tell you who you are, so you believe you exist. When you start to awaken, this need starts to diminish. And when it diminishes, something interesting happens. The conversations that once seemed normal start to feel empty. The relationships that once seemed satisfying start to feel superficial. The social activities that once seemed fun start to feel exhausting, not because there's something wrong with the other people, but because you've started to perceive a dimension of existence that they haven't perceived yet. It's as if you've woken up in the middle of a dream that everyone else is still dreaming. You look around and see people chasing after things that you already know won't bring lasting satisfaction. You hear conversations about worries that you've already realized are created by the mind itself. You witness dramas that you've already understood are fuel for the ego. And then comes the loneliness, not because you've become arrogant or superior, but because you woke up in a world where most are still asleep. Tolle uses a powerful metaphor to describe this. He compares awakening to waking up in the middle of the night while everyone in the house is still asleep. You don't hate the people who are asleep. You don't think you're better than them. You're simply awake, and they're not. And in that state, there's a natural loneliness. That's no one's fault. But here's something that few spiritual teachers admit openly. This loneliness can last for years, decades even, not because you're doing something wrong, but because genuine awakening is rare. Most people who talk about spirituality are still trapped in the spiritual ego. They've exchanged one set of beliefs for another, but the egoic structure remains intact. You recognize these people easily. They're the ones who need to tell everyone how spiritual they are, who use spiritual vocabulary to judge others, who have turned the search for enlightenment into yet another form of ego competition. Being around them can be even more exhausting than being around completely asleep people, and that creates a loneliness in two layers. You don't fit into the ordinary world because you've awakened, and you don't fit into many spiritual circles because you see through their spiritual performance. And this partial awakening is perhaps the most painful phase of all. You see enough to know that something's wrong with the way most people live, but you're not yet established enough in presence to be at peace with it. You're in the middle of the road, neither completely asleep nor completely awake. And this in-between place is lonely, in a way that words can barely describe. Tolle talks about this in A New Earth. He explains that during the process of awakening, you can find yourself in a strange place. The old no longer works. But the new hasn't yet fully established itself, and it's in that interval that the loneliness is most intense, and it's also in that interval that most give up and go back to sleep. But you won't give up, because if you're watching this, something in you already knows that going back is no longer an option. Tolle described it in a way that marked me deeply. He said that his loneliness becomes a practice, that his solitude becomes a teacher. When you close the door, you're not excluding people, you're inviting yourself inside. But hold on, because there's something more here that most spiritual teachings don't reveal. There's a crucial difference between loneliness and solitude, and confusing the two is the mistake that keeps many people trapped in suffering, even after they start to awaken. Loneliness is a feeling of lack, and the ego screaming that it needs something external to feel complete, and the mind telling you there's something wrong with you for being alone. This loneliness hurts because it stems from the fear of not being enough without the validation of others. Solitude is completely different. Solitude is presence. It's being alone without feeling lonely. It's inhabiting your own being with such fullness that the company of others becomes a bonus, not a necessity. Solitude is what Eckhart Tolle found on those park benches in London. He was alone. But he wasn't lonely. He was complete in himself. The transition from loneliness to solitude is exactly what happens when you stop resisting the emptiness and start inhabiting it. Here's a practice that Tolle teaches, and that few really apply. He says, become aware of being aware. Say or think, I am, and don't add anything. Be aware of the stillness that follows the I am. Feel your presence, the naked, stripped, uncovered being. When you do this, something extraordinary happens. The loneliness that seemed unbearable transforms into space, and in that space, you discover something that's always been there, but was covered by the noise of the mind. You discover that you've never really been alone. Tolle explains that the moment you access presence, you connect with something much larger than the person you think you are. You connect with the very consciousness that permeates everything. And in that connection, the idea of loneliness becomes absurd. How can you be alone when you are part of the whole? But here comes the challenge that I need to be honest about. This perception isn't constant at first. You'll have moments of profound connection with presence, followed by moments of intense loneliness. The ego doesn't disappear all at once. It comes back. It resists. It tries to reconquer lost territory. And every time it comes back, the loneliness comes with it. This is normal. This is part of the process, and pretending it isn't would be dishonest. Let me tell you something that happens frequently and that no one talks about. You can have a day of profound peace, a day where presence seems so natural that you wonder how you ever lived any other way. And the next day, you wake up feeling more alone than ever. The ego comes back with full force, bringing thoughts like, "No one understands me. I'm completely isolated. This isn't worth it." In these moments, the temptation to go back is enormous. To call that friend who you know will distract you, to watch something that will anesthetize your mind, to do anything, to not feel what you're feeling. But it's exactly in these moments that the real practice happens, not on the easy days of peace, but on the difficult days of intense loneliness. It's in these days that you decide whether you'll continue awakening or whether you'll go back to sleep. Tolle himself recognizes that sometimes we experience a gravitational force that seems to push us back into unconsciousness. When we feel overwhelmed watching the news or experience a painful loss, it's in these moments that we need to return to the practice of presence. The difference between who awakens and who remains asleep isn't that the awakened never feels loneliness. The difference is that the awakened knows what to do with it, while the sleeping person flees from loneliness, seeking distraction. The awakened uses loneliness as a reminder to return to presence. While the sleeping person blames others for their isolation, the awakened recognizes that loneliness is a call inward. While the sleeping person sees loneliness as punishment, the awakened sees it as preparation. And it's about this preparation that I need to talk about now. Because there's a much greater purpose behind the loneliness of the spiritual path, and that purpose is rarely explained with clarity. Loneliness prepares you for a completely different form of connection. Think about it. Most human relationships are based on need. People come together because they need something from each other. They need validation, security, pleasure, distraction from their own inner emptiness. And what happens? When two empties try to fill each other, they discover that no amount of company eliminates the fundamental emptiness. Then they blame the other, or they seek another partner, or they fill their schedules with social activities, or they buy things, or they get lost in entertainment. Anything to not have to face the emptiness head-on. When you go through loneliness consciously, something different happens. You discover that the emptiness doesn't need to be filled. In fact, the emptiness is the very substance of presence. What you called emptiness was actually space, and in that space, everything can exist without being cramped. And it's from this place of inner completeness that true connections become possible. Not connections based on need, but connections based on overflowing. You don't need the other to feel complete. You share your completeness with the other, and that changes absolutely everything. Tolle talks about conscious relationships in the power of now. He explains that two complete human beings who meet create something very different than two needy human beings trying to complete each other. In the first case, there's space for true love to flow. In the second, there's only need, disguised as love. The loneliness of the spiritual path prepares you for the first type of relationship. It teaches you to be complete alone, so that you can share that completeness with others. It frees you from the compulsion to seek in others what can only be found within you. And here's something crucial. When you stop desperately needing company, ironically, you attract deeper connections. People feel when you're complete in yourself, and that completeness is magnetic, in a way that neediness never will be. Recent research has validated this in interesting ways. A study published on loneliness and spiritual well-being showed that simply participating in religious or spiritual groups has minimal effect against loneliness. Over 37% of people who attend religious groups still say they have no one to talk to. Participation itself isn't enough. What makes a difference is the quality of presence, not the quantity of company. Another research showed that loneliness is defined as a subjective feeling of unhappiness or dissatisfaction with being alone, while social isolation is the objective loss of contact with others. You can be completely isolated and not feel lonely, and you can be surrounded by people and feel devastatingly alone. This confirms exactly what Tolle teaches. Loneliness isn't about external circumstances. It's about your relationship with the present moment. It's about whether you're resisting what is or whether you're at peace with it. Now, I need to talk about something that might be difficult to hear, but it's absolutely necessary for your evolution. The loneliness of the spiritual path isn't temporary. It's a permanent characteristic of someone who is awakening, but the way you experience it changes completely. In the beginning, loneliness feels like punishment. It feels like the universe is punishing you for trying to grow. It feels unfair that just when you start seeking something deeper, you lose connections that once seemed solid. Over time, the loneliness becomes neutral. It simply is. You don't seek it out, but you also don't avoid it. It's part of the landscape of your life without dominating it. And eventually, if you persist on the path, the loneliness reveals itself as what it always was: sacred space, the place where you find yourself, the temple where presence dwells, the doorway that leads to the infinite. Eckhart Tolle said something this November that captures this perfectly. He said that you don't need to apologize for your limits. You don't need to justify your solitude. You don't need to explain why visitors drain you. You are someone who values peace above performance, presence above noise, truth above expectations. Read that again. You are someone who values peace above performance, presence above noise, truth above expectations. If that resonates with you, if you feel that these words describe something you've always known but never managed to articulate, then you are exactly where you need to be. The loneliness you feel isn't a sign that something has gone wrong. It's a sign that something is going very right. But here comes the practical part, because intellectual understanding without application is just another way to avoid the present moment. What do you do with the loneliness when it appears? First, you recognize it without judgment. Don't tell yourself that you shouldn't feel this way. Don't criticize yourself for feeling lonely. Simply notice, loneliness is here. This simple recognition already starts to create space between you and the feeling. Second, you investigate where in the body the loneliness manifests. Every emotion has a physical expression. Loneliness might appear as a tightness in the chest, an emptiness in the stomach, a tension in the shoulders. Bring your attention to that physical sensation, not to change it, but to be present with it. Third, you realize that there's something observing the loneliness. You are not the loneliness. You are that which observes the loneliness arise and eventually pass. This observer is presence, and presence is never lonely because it's connected with everything. Fourth, you use the loneliness as a reminder every time it appears. Instead of fleeing to distractions, use it as a mindfulness bell. It's calling you back home, to the only place where you've never truly been alone. Fifth, and this is perhaps the most important, you stop identifying as someone lonely. The mind loves to create identities. It wants to make the loneliness who you are rather than something you experience temporarily. Every time you think of yourself as a lonely person, you strengthen that identification. And the identification creates more of the same. Instead, simply observe. Loneliness is present now, not I am lonely. The difference seems subtle, but it's transformative. One is a passing experience, the other is a prison of identity. Tolle teaches that the mind becomes quiet enough in solitude for the truth to be heard. You find the living presence that exists beneath all forms, not as a concept, but as a direct experience. And that leads us to the final paradox that I need to share with you. The more you accept the loneliness, the less lonely you become. The more you embrace being alone, the more connected you feel. The more you stop seeking company to fill the void, the more the void reveals itself as fulfillment. That doesn't make sense to the logical mind. The mind says that to not feel lonely, you need more people, more activities, more distractions. But direct experience shows the opposite. The people who are most lonely are those who most flee from loneliness, and the people who are most connected are those who have made peace with being alone. Tolle lived this in his own life. After his awakening, he could have immediately started teaching, seeking followers, building an organization. Instead, he stayed alone for years. He let presence mature in silence. And when he finally started to teach, there was a depth in his words that can only come from someone who has truly inhabited the void. There's a story that Tolle tells about this period. He says that people would pass him on park benches and sometimes sit next to him and start talking. Without knowing who he was or what he had experienced, they were simply drawn to the quality of presence that he emanated. Some cried, others shared deep problems, others just sat in silence next to him. That's what happens when you truly inhabit the loneliness instead of fleeing from it. You become a point of presence in the world, and presence attracts other souls who are also seeking something deeper. Even if they don't know how to name what they're seeking, you are being prepared in the same way. The loneliness you feel isn't an obstacle on your path. It is the path. Now, if you've made it this far, if these words touch something deep within you, then you're part of a very small group of people. Most clicked away in the first few seconds because the truth about loneliness is uncomfortable. Most prefer videos that promise to eliminate loneliness rather than transform their relationship with it. But you stayed, and that says something about you. In the last few minutes, you've received teachings that would normally require years of spiritual practice to discover. You understood the difference between loneliness and solitude. You saw how the ego uses loneliness to keep you trapped. You learned practices that can transform that feeling of lack into a portal for presence. This kind of content exists because people like you support channels that speak uncomfortable truths. If this resonated, if you felt that Tolle was speaking directly to your soul, the super thanks is your way of saying, keep revealing. It's not payment, it's participation. You become a co-creator of these messages that reach other souls who are also walking alone. Before I close, I want to leave you with a practice that can change your experience of loneliness in the coming days. Every time you feel loneliness arising, instead of picking up your phone, instead of calling someone, instead of seeking any form of distraction, do this. Sit in silence. Close your eyes. Say internally, I am. Don't add anything. Just, I am. And then feel the space that opens after those words. In that space, you'll discover that the loneliness was just the outer shell. What was inside it all along was presence, connection with everything, the home you've always searched for elsewhere. But that has always been within you. Eckhart Tolle said that there's a greater purpose at work, and that awakening is more profound than our suffering. The loneliness you feel is part of that greater purpose. It's forging you. It's preparing you. It's freeing you from dependencies you didn't even know you had. Trust the process. Trust the loneliness. Trust yourself. And if at any moment you feel you can't take it anymore, remember this. Every spiritual master who has ever existed went through this same loneliness. Buddha abandoned his family and kingdom and meditated alone under a tree. Jesus spent 40 days alone in the desert. Tolle sat alone on park benches for 2 years. Loneliness isn't a sign of failure, it's a prerequisite for depth. And now tell me in the comments, how long have you been walking this path alone? How many people in your life really understand what you're going through? Have you found the difference between loneliness and solitude in your own experience? Share your journey. Not for me, but for the others watching this video, feeling completely alone in their awakening. Let them know that they're not alone in being alone, that there are others walking in the same direction, even if on different paths. And remember, you haven't closed the door to the world. You've opened the door to yourself, and that's the beginning of everything. Humanity is in the middle of a collective awakening, a blossoming of consciousness. It's up to each of us to start with ourselves, to embrace this change, and to allow the unfolding of something beyond the mind. The loneliness you feel might be exactly that, the universe preparing you to be part of this greater transformation. You're not a stranger in this world. You are the world becoming aware of itself, and sometimes becoming aware requires loneliness, requires space, requires the silence that allows the truth to finally be heard. Your loneliness is sacred. Treat it as such.